But let's start our conversation today on our conversations on CARICOM. And so for that, we're joined by Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM, Ambassador David Comissiong. Good morning to you, Ambassador.
Good morning, Pearson. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, and it is indeed a pleasure to have you here as well. Now, there's been a lot going on. Our Prime Minister has been addressing COP27, this time now in Egypt. And a lot of what she's been saying, we've already said to the rest of the world because it's already documented in the Bridgetown Initiative. Let's listen, if you can. I'll be pull some extracts. I want to listen to some, and then at the end of them all, we will talk a little bit about them. So if we can play where the Prime Minister speaks very much on the whole climate mitigation trust. Let's talk about that in just a minute. Just take a look.
We rely again on natural gas as that clean bridge. This is the bald reality. And we have come here to ask us to open our minds to different possibilities. We believe that we have a plan. We believe that there can be the establishment of a climate mitigation trust that unlocks $5 trillion of private sector savings if we can summon the will to use the SDRs, 500 billion of SDRs, special drawing rights, in a way that unlocks the private sector capital.
Now, that's a very bold statement to make. So talk to me a little bit about what that means and how it relates to the Bridgetown Initiative.
Well, when she says we have a plan, she is in fact referring to the Bridgetown Initiative. And what she has just announced there, the Global Climate Mitigation Trust, that is actually at the core of the Bridgetown Initiative. It is step 3 of the Bridgetown Initiative, and it is designed to launch a massive global assault on the climate crisis. And so what is being proposed, and we have to give, it's not just the Prime Minister, it's also the team around her. Her special advisor on climate is Professor Avinash Prasad. But what they're proposing is that we set up this new institution or mechanism. We capitalize it with 500 billion in IMF special drawing rights. These are these special IMF financial assets, and that's the equivalent of 650 billion US dollars. And then this new institution or mechanism uses that money to leverage private sector savings and investment all over the world, to the ultimate value of some $5 trillion. And all of this money will be going, all of this money which will be lent, not to governments, but which will be lent to projects that are tackling the climate crisis, projects that are, for example, transitioning electricity plants from coal to renewable energy. Any project that will have the capacity to lower the greenhouse gas emissions of the world. So this new institution will leverage up the spending and the investment in all kinds of climate mitigation projects all over the world to the tune of $5 trillion. And the beauty of it is that developing countries like Barbados are already, the governments are already so indebted, they can't afford to take on any new debt. So this would not add to government debt because you'll be financing the private projects, so it doesn't go onto government's balance sheet. And Pearson, this thing is getting traction. I woke up this morning to Professor Prasad sending me a message put out by President Macron of France yesterday. And this is what President Macron is saying. He says, look, at the G20, France will support increase reallocation of special drawing rights. We launched this idea with PM Motley, Prime Minister Motley, whose courage, ambition, and inspiring vision we heard early on today of a high-level expert task force to make recommendations for fast, innovative financing of climate mechanisms at the next spring meetings in 2023, that's the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, in the next 6 months, IMF, OECD, World Bank, we need to come up with concrete proposals to activate the innovative financing mechanisms. We need to transform our logic, otherwise, it will be too late. We do this in partnership with Prime Minister Motley for next spring 2023. This is implementation. We cannot wait for the next COP. That's President Macron yesterday. So we developing countries, we did not create this crisis. We are on the front lines of it, but this new institution, will help the world, to really come to grips with and solve this climate crisis.
You know, the Prime Minister said quite a lot indeed, and I'm glad to hear that even France is recognizing the call for concessional financing to be able to respond when vulnerable societies like ourselves are impacted. But she also took some time to explain Barbados' national disaster pandemic clause in our government bonds. And I'd like to hear from the Prime Minister, then I want you to break that down too for Barbadians so we understand what those disaster pandemic clauses are. Let's take a listen first.
Similarly, we accept that there was and must be a commitment to unlocking concessional funding for climate vulnerable countries. There is no way that developing countries who have been graduated can fight this battle without access to concessional funding. We heard it on this stage from the head of my old alma mater at LSU. We believe as well that the time has come for the introduction of natural disaster and pandemic clauses in our debt instruments. I have said that if Barbados is hit tomorrow, because we have natural disaster clauses, God forbid if we are hit tomorrow, we unlock 18% of GDP over the next 2 years, because what we do is effectively put a pause on all of our debt and put it at the end for 2 years and put it at the end, and we pay back that money at the end. But what we get is the flexibility in the first 2 years to address issues of damage and loss.
And that's it. You get financial flexibility to be able to respond to issues of damage and loss. And tie it in now to the Bridgetown Initiative.
Yes, well, it's part of the Bridgetown Initiative. This is a Barbadian innovation that Barbados is introducing to the rest of the world. Barbados came up with a bright idea. Look, if Barbados is hit by a devastating hurricane, and our priority then becomes how do we rebuild? And we have to use all of our money to deal with the rebuilding and coming to the rescue of suffering people. How could we still be paying payments on our foreign debt? So what Barbados has done is whenever we now issue government bonds, when we are borrowing money, we now put a clause in all of those bonds which says, if our country is hit by a natural disaster or a pandemic, then for a period of 2 years, we will be relieved of having to make any payments on these bonds, on these debts that we owe. So we give ourselves that 2-year period to focus all of our resources on rebuilding. And so Barbados is offering that. Barbados is saying this should not just be a Barbados initiative. This should be across the board for the entire world. Because when a crisis hits you, it's not of you haven't caused it, and you must be permitted to focus on responding to that crisis. But the Bridgetown Initiative is also proposing, in fact, to even go beyond that, that the world, the international community needs to set up a special fund that a lot of the resources can come from multinational companies, like oil companies, that have contributed big time to global warming, to tax them, to contribute to a fund that will be available to developing countries when they are hit by a natural disaster like a hurricane and devastated, that they should be given grants to rebuild. They should not have to go and borrow money and take on debt to try to rebuild. They didn't cause the climate crisis. They're now the victim of it, and there should be reconstruction grants to rebuild. So all of this is in the Bridgetown Initiative. The idea that the multilateral development banks need to upscale their activities. They need to be making an additional US $1 trillion available to governments all over the world at concessional rates and long repayment periods. We are saying 30 years to build resilience to climate and to achieve the sustainable development goals, the long-term development goals of proper education systems, proper public health systems, except, no hunger, getting rid of hunger in countries all over the world. So all of this, Pearson, is the Bridgetown Initiative, and Barbadians should feel very proud that we have been the facilitators, not just our ideas alone. Many people contributed to these ideas, but we brought them to Barbados and we helped to put together a package of ideas that, if you judge now from the comments made by President Macron, the world, it seems as though these ideas are getting traction and stand a very good chance of being implemented.
Prime Minister went on to talk about reformation of some of those financial institutions as well. And, you know, she called the phrase the Bretton Woods. And for a lot of people, they're wondering, what is that? Do you have any idea what is Bretton Woods?
And finally, we believe that the multilateral development banks have to reform. Yes, it is time for us to revisit Bretton Woods. Yes, it is time for us to remember that those countries who sit in this room today did not exist at the time that the Bretton Woods institutions were formed, for the most part. And therefore we have not seen, we have not been heard sufficiently. And if we are therefore to rise to the occasion, to play our part to stop the tragic loss of life that we have seen on these screens and the impact on livelihoods that we are feeling across our countries, then there needs to be a new deal with respect to the Bretton Woods institutions. And we need to ensure that they have a different view to their risk appetite, that we look at the SDRs, and that we look at other innovative ways to expand the lending that is available from billions to trillions.
So when the Prime Minister speaks about Bretton Woods, what is she talking about?
Well, at the end of the Second World War in 1945, there was a major, all of the independent countries of the world, and back then there were only 51. All of the Caribbean were colonies, Africa, most of Asia. So these countries came together at a place called Bretton Woods. And it was there at that conference that the World Bank and the World Bank group of institutions, the World Bank is not just one institution. There are four. There's a World Bank group of institutions and the International Monetary Fund. This is where these institutions were born. So these are the major global financial institutions. So they are known as the Bretton Woods institutions. And the point that Prime Minister Motley is making here is really is at the core of the Bridgetown Initiative, which is this idea that, look, back in 1945, nations like Barbados did not exist. So we were not at the table. Africa was not at the table, Asia, not the Caribbean. And so when these institutions were constructed back then, they were constructed with a bias towards the countries that existed then, the European, North American, a few Latin American. And so you do not have the presence and influence and voting power of black and brown countries and people in these institutions, and that needs to change. These institutions need now to be brought into the 21st century. There are now 195 independent countries in the world, and the black and brown African and Caribbean countries and governments, we need to be given our rightful space within these institutions. And in fact, we go beyond just the formal Bretton Woods institutions. We're saying that even informal groupings that have tremendous influence on world policy, like the G20, why isn't it the G21? Why isn't the African Union included, brought to that table when these policies are being developed? Because African Union represents 1.4 billion African people. So this is one of the overarching ideas, that we revamp these institutions, we bring them into the 21st century, not only in terms of our black and brown presence and influence within them, but in changing, reshaping the functions that they perform and the scale at which those functions are performed, so that they are more meeting the critical developmental needs of developing countries like African and Caribbean countries.
The Bridgetown Initiative explained globally and locally as well. Ambassador Comissiong, thank you so much. We have to leave it right there, sir, and I do look forward to engaging with you again next week, if it be God's will. Thank you.
Morning, morning, morning.